Hi, this is Misha, and we thought we would take a closer look at the Enfield rifled series. Now, we did a video about a year and a half ago, and it was kind of an all-encompassing video, and it was really our first of these CNR type guns, and it really needs to be revisited and kind of looking at more in detail. Now, this video is going to look at the original Lee-Metford, as well as the early Lee-Enfield MLE, or Emily as it's often called. Now, there are a few names to keep in mind when we're doing this. There's, of course, James Paris Lee, who designed the bolt system. He also designed the magazine. We have William Metford, who originally designed the rifling used in the Lee-Metford's Boer. And we have Joseph Speed, who designed a few things such as the magazine feed cutoff and the dust cover and some other small things. And he did some sight work as well. Now, the Lee-Enfield is interesting. Work began in the mid-1880s, and the original Lee-Metford was going to fire a black powder 303 caliber cartridge, also known as 7.7 by 58, rimmed. But then France introduced the Lebel and its 8 by 50 smokeless cartridge. So when they introduced the Lee-Metford in 1888, they basically just replaced black powder with smokeless, thinking it would be alright. And the action, to be fair, was strong enough to handle a smokeless powder round. So the original Lee-Metford, as I said, was adopted in 1888. It was the MLM magazine Lee-Metford Mark I. And this isn't it. This is the closest I've got to it. But it wouldn't have the safety on the bolt here. Rather, it would have a safety mounted on the receiver, toggle style. It would use a single stack 8-round mag, still detachable, still Lee pattern, and it would use a slightly different style of sight. In 1892, the MLM Mark I Star was introduced, and it would go away from the receiver mounted safety and would not have a safety on the bolt either. It would just have a half cock like here. They felt that was enough with the Mark I Star, introduced in 1892. Now, they would also go to the more modern styles of sights like these. Well, I shouldn't say modern, but the sights we know here. Sliding ladder. And funnily enough, about 2 weeks after they introduced the Mark I Star, and they introduced the Mark II, which was the same gun, but now we're going to the Lee-designed 10-round double-stack detachable mag. Get it here. Now, because there were concerns about soldiers losing the magazine, they would chain it to the rifle. Now, it is worth noting that they would issue a spare mag, a spare 10-round mag, which a soldier would keep in a vest pocket or a trouser pocket. So they would have 10 in the chamber and the magazine and 10 in their pocket. Now, the Lee-Metford Mark II, as with this one here, could not be topped off with stripper clips. You still had the single load. And we have the magazine cutoff designed by Joseph Speed. So the idea was to drop single rounds in, and when emergencies happened, when your position was being overrun or when you needed to have an offensive, you could take the magazine feed off, stick it out, and do it. I've heard that the reason they made a very visible cutoff like this is so a commanding officer, NCO, a sergeant, or whoever, could easily tell if his men had the mag cutoff on or off. Would make sense because most of the other mag cutoffs used in that era, which was a common feature, by the way, were a little less obtrusive. They're usually a switch or a toggle. Now, in 1894, they would introduce this carbine here. This is the LMC Mark I Cavalry Carbine, and it was obviously introduced for cavalry troops. Now this is an original Lee-Metford gun. Whereas the long rifle had a 30-inch barrel, this has an 18-inch, so we're about a foot shorter. We have a different style of front sight. We're protected. A different type of upper handguard here. The rear sight is the same pattern, but we have this cover on it. So I can pry this up there, rotate it around, get it out of the way. They put that on so horse-mounted soldiers wouldn't damage the rear sights. Same style as you see, just covered up. They had this long front handguard. They did not have a rear. They would go to a shorter 6-round detachable Lee pattern magazine, still also chained to the gun. We still have the same dust cover over the bolt. And while we still have a turned down bolt handle as on the rifle, it's further turned down, and the knob, instead of being a round knob, has been flattened. Now this is worth noting because it was the LMC Carbine, the Lee-Metford Carbine, that introduced this safety on the bolt. Specifically, it's actually on the cocking piece. It's a little awkward to engage, but to disengage, it's very ergonomic. We still have half cock as well. We can easily manually cock it. To put the safety on, we just kind of pull it back and flick it up. Like I said, it's a little harder to get on because you got to get it up with the notch, and that holds the bolt cocking piece just a little bit further back and won't let it go. But when you need to fire, you're good to go. We have a rear mounted side sling bar. And as with the rifle, we have a trap door in the butt plate. Now this trap door in both the rifle and the carbine was used to store an oiler and a cleaning rope. The rods under the barrel on this one, as well as the rifle we looked at, are actually more used for clearing rods. They're not cleaning rods as such. They were used for clearing jams or obstructions in the barrel. Keep in mind these were adopted right after smokeless powder. They still had the muzzle loading black powder mindset. So, you know, we'll see that soon get deleted. If you look at this gun, in addition to the changes we talked about, they really just rounded a lot of the edges. The mag, the trigger guard, they put this on to keep the rear sight protected and from snagging. They lightened it and they rounded it up to keep it from snagging on clothing. They would also carry these in scabbards on horseback. So that introduced the safety. And in 1895, they would introduce a long rifle version, the MLM Mark II Star, which would have this safety on it. So we finally would get this safety on the cocking piece of our rifle in 1895. Earlier, I think it was February of 1895. However, we were having problems not so much with the rifle, but the Metford rifling in the bore. Metford had designed his rifling for black powder. It had shallow lands and grooves. It was very rounded. The idea was black powder residue would adhere to it less and be easier to clean out, which is 100% true. It also meant the rifling wore way faster. Not a problem if we were shooting black powder .303, but shooting early cordite loadings, we were wearing away the rifling in only 5,000 or 6,000 rounds, which is not much for a military rifle for general issue. So what they did, the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield designed a new barrel with new rifling in it. It was squared off with deeper grooves, and this became the quintessential original Lee-Enfield. It was adopted in November of 1895 as the MLE, the Emily, as soldiers often called it, Mark I. This rifle here was made in 1896, so it is a relatively early Mark I, often called, for obvious reasons, a long Lee. So the only difference between a late production Metford rifle, a Mark II Star, and an early production Enfield rifle, a Mark I Star, a Mark I, is the bore, the barrel. Also receiver markings. They would even quite frequently, let me just keep this here, they would even quite frequently rebarrel Metford guns and remark them with Enfield barrels. Now one feature we haven't talked, sling swivels, fun things. One feature we haven't talked about are the volley sights. These are pretty famous. This is your dial. You can dial it out to 2,000 yards or more. I think it goes up to 2,800, very far. And then you flip up this rear sight here. This is not adjustable, it just has a fixed thing. This is where you make your adjustments for range. Now this wasn't obviously for single man aimed infantry fire. This was for unit volley fire. And if you get a couple hundred guys all shooting at 1,500 yards, some bullets might find target. It's kind of like an artillery, mini little artillery piece. It may be goofy by today's standards, but in the late 19th century, there was a push. People thought with the new smokeless powder replacing black powder and the newer projectiles going smaller and faster, range and accuracy would be the new determining factors on the battlefield. And this was just one way to try to take advantage of as much range as possible with the new first Lee-Metford and then later Lee-Enfield. We've already talked about the chained magazine. We have typical sling swivels. We also have a stacking swivel up here. And we have a bayonet lug to take the pattern 1888 bayonet with its clearing rod here underneath it. And we have an unprotected blade front sight. Now the cavalry carbine did not have a bayonet lug because cavalry were expected to use their sabers in combat and weren't expected to need a bayonet. It's just also one less piece of kit to saddle them with. 1899, 1900, the British get involved in the Boer War, and this was the really first proving ground of the Lee-Metford and Lee-Enfield. Originally, the troops stationed in Africa mostly had Lee-Metfords, but replacement troops and reserve troops that came in would sometimes have the newer Lee-Enfield. The barrel problem we already knew about with the Metfords, so it was no surprise when the barrels would wear out prematurely. One thing that was surprising, when the Enfields came over, it was found that their sights were not properly calibrated from the factory. So they had to kind of do a field ad hoc repair to get the sights on target. They were hitting about 18 inches to the left, and they were also off vertically as well. They quickly discovered that the Boers using Mausers firing 7mm 7x57, and they were model 1893 with some 1895s thrown in as well, had better accuracy and better range, and had a faster rate of fire. Again, a gun like this, you do have a 10-round mag, which is nice, but when you use it up, you have to single load it. The Mauser only had a 5-round magazine, but it could easily be refilled with stripper clips. This gave, in a sustained prolonged firefight, advantage to the Boers. This on top of better range and better accuracy too, because of the 7mm cartridge. It was also a rimless cartridge, whereas the 303 again had a rim. And rim cartridges can experience something known as rim lock. And this is doubly true for these double stack higher capacity magazines in an infield. You know, when you have 5 cartridges, you have 5 chances for rim lock. When you have 10, you have 10. So soldiers had to be somewhat careful how they loaded their magazines if they wanted to use them as opposed to a single shot rifle. So problems were experienced early on. As for the carbine, which also saw quite a bit of use in that war, it didn't do so hot either. It had the same loading problems. Yes, it was shorter and lighter, but it was very much outranged and outclassed by the Mauser. So in the end, quite a few units originally equipped with either Metford or Enfield carbines would be re-equipped with rifles, because at least it gave them the range and accuracy they needed, even if it wasn't as light as handy. Long story short, these original patterns just did not do that great during the war. And this would cause the British to very quickly go back to the drawing board after and really towards the end of the Boer War. Now we'll get into what happened there, which I'm sure most of you know, in the next video in this series. But before we go, we want to talk about the last versions in this series. In my hands is a so-called New Zealand carbine. This is based on the Lee-Enfield carbine, Mark I star. And it is essentially the same gun, but now we have a bayonet lug for the pattern 1888 bayonet. Now if you notice, there's no hole for a clearing rod here. That was deleted in 1899 with the Mark I star. They would get rid of the clearing rod. It really didn't do anything, it just added weight and complexity. And again, we're keeping our actual cleaning kit, rope and oiler, in the buttstock. The New Zealand carbines would first be ordered in 1901, and these would be built from, these were brand new construction guns. In fact, the New Zealand is interesting for being the last new production Lee-Enfield of the original pattern of either MLE or LEC. What they would do, they would take an LEC type receiver and they would use a Martini Enfield barrel. And the reason they would do this, it's a little bit thicker and heavier, and it has the same muzzle diameter to accommodate the 1888 bayonet. Have a full length stock here. We'd have a typical upper handguard. We have typical rear sights. We're still using a dust cover and a chained 6-round mag. Since these were meant for police use, they have more traditional bottom mounted sling swivels, although they do not have a stacking swivel as such. They would originally produce 1,000 for New Zealand in 1901, and then they would do a second order in 1903 of 500. So about 1,500 of these were built from the ground up, brand new guns, as essentially an LEC carbine to mount a bayonet. And they are mostly meant for constable police use. And the final gun model in the series is very similar to this. It's called the Irish Constabulary Carbine, or Royal Irish Constabulary Carbine, RIC I should say. These were older guns like this, be they Enfield or Metford barrels, that were reworked reconditioned and reworked to take a P88 bayonet. So what they would do, they would put a ring on the end of the muzzle, they would cut back the forearm, and they would attach a bayonet lug. This is why with the RICs you'll always see a splice. They had to kind of rework the handguard to take it. They'll also have older dates on the receivers because they were reconditioned guns. They were making them at a time, basically what they worked out with the Irish police, the constabulary. They didn't need these old carbines anymore. They would give the Irish the carbines if they would pay for the conversion to take a bayonet. So the guns are free, the conversion was not. They would start to convert the RICs in 1904, and they would keep converting them for the Irish up until about 1914 with the beginning of World War I. In all, they would do about 11,200, give or take, of the RIC, Royal Irish Constabulary carbine. Kind of an interesting variant, very similar to the New Zealand. We don't really have an exact number of how many of these were made, be they Metfords, Mark I, Mark I stars, so on and so forth. It wasn't a very large number, though. It really wasn't. For the Longley here, they would build a little over 590,000. And that seems to include both Mark I and Mark I star. I've seen some different numbers, but they seem a little hard to believe, so looks like about a little under 600,000 total for this version, both types. So relatively high production, considering they didn't go into production until the mid-1890s, and they were already out by the early 20th century. Keep in mind some were also converted older Lee-Metfords. And you're going to see that a lot with British guns as this continues. They would take older receivers, in some cases also older barrels, and rework them into new patterns, so it kind of makes getting exact numbers a little more difficult. But yeah, these are the original Lee-Metfords and Lee-Enfields. And this would really start the whole series. There is a note, too, about the Hague Convention. The first types of bullets made for these, at least getting back past, once you get into the 1890s, the Mark II, the Mark III, once you get into the Mark III, they would try to do kind of a soft nose bullet, and then the Mark IV and Mark V were a true hollow point. These would be banned by the Hague Convention, and this would be why you end up seeing so many marks of the 303 cartridge. You had the Mark VI, which was attempt to be Hague Convention compliant and so on and so forth, and we would go up to the Mark VIII and even beyond. So you'll see quite a few different 303 loadings. But we'll get into those as this series progresses. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below. Really appreciate you tuning in. Enfields have always kind of been a thing of mine. I think they're really interesting. Hope you do too. If you have any suggestions or whatnot, please let us know. We're happy to take them into consideration doing any kind of new series. If you liked the video, please click. If you haven't already subscribed, we'd really appreciate it if you'd do so. This is Misha, and please tune in again soon for more on the British Lee-Enfield.